Welcome to episode 6 of Indie Pub News with Michael Gallagher. Today, we honor veterans as Veterans Day approaches, and we have the pleasure of interviewing R. Gray Hoover, a Vietnam-era veteran and the proud author of a family history based on actual experiences of United States veterans and official Asian history records from World War II. Kicker, The Forgotten Front, a World War II thriller about a family's hardships on the home front and the Army airmen who flew unarmed missions over Japanese territory in China, Burma, and India. Kicker, The Forgotten Front, 7 years in the making, is a thriller that Gray Hoover sourced by interviewing many World War II veterans.
Good morning, Gray Hoover. What a pleasure it is to meet you here.
Nice meeting you too, Michael.
I'm sure loads of people have a family story they'd love to tell. What was the most rewarding experience for you as a writer and as a family member in writing this kind of family history?
Well, the most rewarding part of it was actually in getting to meet so many veterans from the Second World War. They're fast disappearing. And I spent 7 years in researching my book, and it was just wonderful to be able to talk to these gentlemen, hear their stories, and then to share those stories in a published book.
And did you go to meet them, or did you talk to them on the phone?
I went to meet a lot of them. The China, Burma, India veterans had what groups they called bashes, which is a term that in India used for houses. So each little group had their own basha, and they usually met monthly. And I was able to get to quite a few of them and actually meet them and participate in their meetings, interview them.
Okay. Could you give listeners some tips on how to plan a project like yours?
Well, a lot of work involved. Like I said, I researched for 7 years, and I can't stress enough the importance of research. Know your facts. Lay out your story. I diagrammed my story and then filled in as I went along. And be very organized. And most of all, just keep at it.
Perseverance is the big one, eh?
Yes.
Okay, let's change it up a bit here and talk a bit about your family's story. Could you tell us something about your family's experience in the Forgotten Front of World War II?
Well, my father served in the Army Air Force in the CBI theater. He was an aircrew member, and his official title was Flight Traffic Clerk, which doesn't really give you an idea what they did at all. They became known as kickers because what they would do is they would load up their aircraft, fly out over, most of the time it was over the jungles in Burma, to where there were elements of the either frontline elements or behind the line elements of the Allies that they would drop the supplies to. As they approached their drop zones, one crew member or two would position bundles of supplies, usually anywhere from 100 to sometimes 200 pounds. Some had parachutes attached, others didn't. They would position them in front of the aircraft door. It was an open door. Then another crew member would lay on his back beside that bundle, place his feet in the middle of the bundle with his knees flexed. And then when the pilot gave the signal to drop, the person laying on his back would kick the bundle out the door. That's where the term kicker comes from.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. What prompted you to write your historical fiction, Kicker?
Well, my father died at age 56 in 1978, and he left a lot of unanswered questions about his service time. So once I retired, I thought, I'm going to dig into his military experience more and just create a document for the family of his experiences. And that's how it started. But as I mentioned earlier, when I started interviewing and meeting the veterans and hearing their stories, I knew I had to tell their stories as well as my father's. So it evolved more into a historical novel at that point rather than just a document.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the historical side of the story now.
Okay.
What exactly is the Forgotten Front?
Well, the Forgotten Front is what was known as the China, Burma, India theater in World War II. It was the largest theater in land area in World War II. It was like 4,000 miles from north to south from Manchuria to the southern tip of India, and about 3,500 miles from western India to eastern China. It was an area that encompassed the highest mountains on Earth, the Himalayas, some of the thickest jungles and driest deserts. They experienced temperatures well below zero to over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And because of the moist air coming off of the Bay of Bengal and bumping into the Himalayas, it had the worst flying conditions of any place on Earth.
Well, why do you think the veterans of the Forgotten Front are not celebrated in the same way as the other front veterans on Veterans Day?
I feel that it's basically because of the number of soldiers that were in the different theaters. Of course, there were a lot more in the European theater and Africa and the Pacific, and their priorities were much higher than the priorities for the CBI. So the CBI was like at the bottom of the list for supplies and replacements. So right from the start, they didn't have the recognition or that the other fronts were getting. And of course, like Europe had D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and all of those great, huge battles. And it just seemed like right from the very start that they didn't have the recognition. And to this day, they don't. I've watched many TV programs dedicated to World War II, and very, very rarely do you see any mention at all of the CBI theater.
Would you briefly highlight who Sam is and his path to the Forgotten Front?
Well, Sam really is, most of his experiences were my father's experiences, but because I wanted to tell the story of other veterans, I've included their story through him as a protagonist. My father started out in 1943, and he wanted to become a pilot, but when he took the test, he missed by 1 point. So he went into the Army as a mechanic. He was a mechanic in the Civilian Conservation Corps when he was 18 years old. So he just transferred that knowledge into his Army experience. And he was stationed in Fort McPherson in Georgia, where he was getting additional training as a mechanic. And he became aware of a call for volunteers for a composite group, aircrew members, to supply Merrill's Marauders. And he volunteered for that. And that is how he got sent basically to the CBI theater.
There's a scene in the book as they're approaching Cairo. And what did the pilot do that was unusual?
Well, I think it was typical a lot of times back then as they were approaching some site that had something of extreme interest that they would circle. And in that case, it was the Great Pyramids around Cairo. Of course, today you couldn't do that because of all the air traffic regulations. But during the war, those pilots, they were pretty free to do a lot of what they wanted.
Okay. What was special about Sam's training as a kicker?
He had to have a working knowledge of loading an airplane so that the load was in what they call the weight and balance limits of the airplane. If a load is too far forward or too far aft in an aircraft, it throws the weight and balance out, and the aircraft can become very unmanageable and sometimes crash. So they had to have a working knowledge of weight and balance. They had to have a very good knowledge of how to secure the loads. Most of the time, these aircraft were loaded from 6,000 to 7,000 pounds of supplies. And if you're flying around the humid jungle or around the Himalayas, where I was saying that some of the worst flying weather in the world, aircraft gets tossed around quite a bit. And of course, if your load comes loose and shifts, it can be very dangerous and sometimes fatal to the whole crew. So they had to have those kind of knowledges, as well as they had to work very efficiently to get the loads in the doorway and ejected. Typically, they would get 3 packages ejected in one pass, and then they'd have to go around and do further passes to completely unload the aircraft.
Okay, so you got my next question there, too, how it was dangerous.
It was the most dangerous part of their job was they were dropping supplies almost entirely to frontline troops or troops behind enemy lines. So each time they would approach a drop zone, they would be flying very low, just a couple of 100 feet, and very slow. And that subjected them to enemy fire from the ground and also from the air. So that was where the most danger were. They were almost always under fire during a mission.
Okay. What message would you like to communicate to Americans on Veterans Day this year?
Well, it's been very heartening to me over the past few years to see young people especially thanking veterans for their service. I personally am a Vietnam era veteran, and there was very little recognition for veterans of that era. So I think it's nice and important that people continue to recognize our veterans and honor them because they deserve it. Their job is not always glamorous. It does require sacrifice, and unfortunately, too many of them lose their lives. So never forget them. I guess that would be my message.
Is there anything else you'd like to add today, Gray?
Well, I'd just like to thank you once again for this opportunity. And as we approach Veterans Day this year, I hope everybody will get out there and honor as many vets as they can.
Well, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you as well. It was really a pleasure. And do you have another book in mind or another family story that you'd like to get going?
Well, not currently.
This was 7 years research was enough?
Yes. And I'm getting older now, so it's a little more difficult.
Yeah. Well, this was a pleasure, Gray. Thanks for dropping by, Gray, from all of us here at Indie Pub News. I really enjoyed talking to you and reading Kicker. I'm proud to honor all veterans. Get out there, everyone, at Veterans Day and thank veterans for their service. Just type GREYHOOVER at Amazon and grab your copy of Kicker today. Maybe some of you out there have a family history to tell. Take Gray's example and get on it. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to sign up at iTunes Podcast or your favorite podcast channel. See you soon.